Hotel. Welcome back, everybody, to Matthew Daniels TV. Y'all see the title: United States Colored Troop Soldier William I. Johnson Jr. Today, we're going to be talking about the United States Colored Troops, and we're going to be highlighting someone who was born in slavery, escaped slavery during the Civil War, and joined the Union Army. A lot of times I feel like we don't shed enough light on our brothers who fought valiantly. Now, the individual that we're going to be highlighting today didn't actually engage in any gun battles. He was there for a lot of gun battles, but he had a different job. And we're going to be highlighting his job. But this particular ancestor, William Johnson Jr., he left us a narrative that we can examine and highlight the amazing work that the United States colored troops put in. Now, as we get into this, let's ask ourselves, what exactly is the United States colored troops? A lot of us already know that during the Civil War, when the North was fighting the South, at some point in the war in 1963, the Union Army, the North, the quote unquote Yankees, they realized that in order to win the war, they needed the help of the Negro population. So there were several debates which took place amongst members of the white society. Some people thought that it was dangerous to arm the Negroes after subjecting them to slavery and oppression for so many years. And some people thought that because the Negro race had been placed into slavery and oppressed for so long, that they would not fight. They didn't believe that the Negro population would be willing to stand up like men in the face of war, in the face of certain death. They didn't know if they would tuck tail and run on the battlefield. They didn't see members of the Negro race as human, as men, as stand-up individuals, as people that would fight for themselves. And so there was great debate when the Civil War kicked off about the ability of members of the Negro race actually joining the armed forces. There were some who were for, and there were some who were against, obviously. And so eventually the decision was made to arm the Negro, create colored regiments, and allow the Negro to fight. And after the Negro was armed and allowed to fight, in newspapers printed all across the nation, it was stated that the debate was solved. They said that the question of whether or not the Negro would stand up like a man and fight for his freedom, they said that that question had been answered, and it had been answered in the affirmative. So what we're going to do today, we're going to be highlighting not only the exploits of the United States colored troops, we're going to be talking about one of our ancestors who was a United States colored troop, a man by the name of William I. Johnson Jr. And we're going to be seeing some of the battles that he was there for, and we're going to be looking at it from his perspective. I see we have Sandra Askew in the building. She says, good afternoon, Ampu, the real bookworm. Good afternoon to you as well. Thank you for tapping in. I hope your day is going good. So what I want to do, let me get the screen share started. And the first thing that we're going to be looking at is, hold on just a second. We're going to be looking at some sources and some information about the United States colored troops. So give me just a second. Let me pull that up, make sure my audio is good. United States colored. Okay, good. The audio is good. The screen is sharing. All right. So where we're going to go to first is this website is the National Museum of the United States Army. And this particular article is titled United States Colored Troops in the American Civil War. Let's see what it has to say. A forgotten history. African American service in the United States military began long before the U.S. Civil War in 1861. African American men served in state. Matter of fact, let me blow that up a little bit. Let me see if I can blow that up so you can see it better. Okay. African American service in the United States military began long before the U.S. Civil War in 1861. African American men served in state and private militias from the outset of the American Revolution. In 1778, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment became the first majority black regiment in the nation's history and participated in the Battle of Rhode Island and the Siege of Yorktown before war's end. Why is what they said just why is what they just said really, really, really important? Because generally when we talk about the United States colored troops, we go directly to the time period of the American Civil War. Now, the U.S. Civil War took place between 1861 and 1865. And so an individual talking about Negroes in the military fighting for this country, they may be predisposed to go to the years between 1861 and 1865. But in all actuality, the Negro race was fighting in wars since the American Revolution. And according to the National Museum of the United States Army, there were Negroes fighting in a majority black regiment in 1778. That's almost 100 years prior to the American Civil War, right? And they're saying that African American men, members of the Negro race, served in state and private militias from the outset of the American Revolution. The American Revolution goes all the way back to 1776. So in all actuality, members of the Negro race have been fighting in basically every war that has ever taken place on American soil. Let's rip that Band-Aid off. Our ancestors have always been willing to stand up straight and fight. Always. Even before the official United States colored troops were created in 1863. Look what it goes on to say. In the War of 1812, African American soldiers fought alongside other units in the successful defense of New Orleans in 1815 and repulsed British attacks elsewhere while serving in both integrated and segregated units throughout the volunteer army. So the American Revolution was the Americans, members of the 13 colonies, claiming independence from the British and fighting a war of independence from King George and the British Empire overseas. We fought in that war. Now, several decades later, in 1812, there was another war with the British, and the Negroes fought in the War of 18 against the British as well. They fought in New Orleans in 1815 and successfully helped to repulse British attacks. Again, 1815 is decades before the American Civil War and before the creation of the United States colored troops. So what we have to understand is that with the formation of the United States colored troops was not the beginning of African Americans, blacks, Negroes fighting in wars. Okay, we've always been right there. We always fought. We always been willing to stand up straight. But because of racism and bigotry in this country, when the Civil War took place, a lot of people were acting like they didn't believe that the descendants of slaves would fight valiantly. It goes on to say, after the war, state and federal laws prohibited African Americans from continuing their valued service in the military. Racial prejudice and a growing concern over slave rebellions not only prevented African American men from enlisting, but also suppressed the ability of African American veterans to receive proper recognition for their service. So basically what they're saying is, in times of war, when they needed help, they enlisted Negroes to help in the war, but in times of peace, they didn't want Negroes in the army learning how to fight, having the right to bear arms, because ultimately they feared slave rebellions. They feared an uprising. Although we helped them fight in the American Revolution, and although we helped them fight in the War of 1812, a lot of our ancestors were still enslaved in the South and getting treated very, very badly. And there was still oppression, and there were still laws that clearly made a distinction between white and black. So in time of war, when they wanted to win the war, they utilized our help on the battlefield. But in times of peace, they did not want us to be in the army because they didn't want us trained. They didn't want us carrying arms because they feared that we would eventually turn the arms and the weapons against them, seeing them as our oppressor. But for whatever reason, our ancestors, they never did that. They never had any intentions on doing that. They say even after the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861, the Lincoln administration and state governors were reluctant to recruit African Americans for service for over a year, as Union losses mounted following the Battle of Bull Run and the Peninsula Campaign. The federal and state governments refused to enlist thousands of eager African Americans. Pause. Eager African Americans, meaning members of the Negro race. When the Civil War kicked off, those who were already in free states, they were begging to fight. They were begging to fight. They were begging to help out. They were begging to put boots on the ground and kick some Confederate butt. But the fear of rebellion kept legislation from being passed that would legitimize Negroes fighting in the wars, getting paid regular salaries, and being armed and trained. It was all fear. So even when they were having the debates about whether or not the Negro would fight, that was kind of like smoke and mirrors, right? That was smoke and mirrors. The real question wasn't whether or not the Negro was willing to fight. They had been fighting for over about a century prior to that. They had been fighting since the American Revolution. And there had been several uprisings, several insurrections, several slave revolts showing that the Negro was willing to die for liberty and freedom. But the real issue was that the European population was afraid. They said that they were debating whether or not the Negro would actually fight. But what they were really concerned about is if the Negro would turn their guns on them. But they didn't want to admit that they were afraid. So instead of admitting that they were afraid and admitting that they didn't want to legitimize colored troops because they thought that those colored troops would turn the guns on them as the oppressor, they made it appear that the argument was whether or not the Negro would stand up straight and fight valiantly. Look what they say. However, even though this debate was going on, however, several Union generals took matters into their own hands. In the East, Major General Benjamin F. Butler took command of Union forces near Fort Monroe, Virginia. In May 1861, 3 escaped enslaved men arrived in his camp seeking their freedom. Butler labeled them as contraband of war, meaning that since the Confederacy viewed these men as property, the Union Army had just as much right to their use as the enemy. Now, I want you to remember the name Major General Benjamin F. Butler. He is very crucial and critical to the man that we're going to be talking about today, William I. Johnson Jr. So there was, during the Civil War, when it first kicked off, there was a very, very interesting dynamic. You had states where Negroes were free in the North, and you had states where Negroes were still enslaved in the South. Then you had this war between the South and the North kick off. And so you had Negroes from the South escaping and going north. And now in some instances, this is documented history. In some instances, when those Negroes would escape the plantation in the South and make it to the North would turn those men back over to the plantation owners in the South. They would turn them back over because remember, even though there were free Negro states in the North, or there were free states in the North where slavery had already been abolished, a lot of these people were still racist and they were still bigots. And even the ones that weren't overtly racist, they still were raised in a society where the class system of the day was white on top, black on the bottom. So even though they didn't condone slavery, they still saw a difference between black and white. And there were members of the Union Army, although they were fighting the Confederacy, they still saw members of the Confederacy as more so their brothers and countrymen more than they saw the Negro race as their brothers and countrymen, because the racial divide was so deeply ingrained into the psyche of the American citizen, even in the middle of the Civil War. But there were some, a lot actually, who saw the Negro as a man, as a woman, as a human being, and completely disagreed with the institution of slavery. There were even majors, generals, lieutenants, rank and file members of the Union Army who saw the humanity in the Negro race. One of these men was Major General Benjamin F. Butler. He was one of the first to advocate arming the Negroes and allowing them to fight. And so many people debated against him about this, but he was of the opinion that, look, if you put a gun in their hand and you put them on the front line facing those Confederates who have enslaved them, who have enslaved their mothers, who has enslaved their fathers, who has enslaved their children, sold them off, beat them, tied them up, stripped them, deprived them, oppressed them, killed them, they're going to fight harder than the Europeans in the Union War is going to fight. And obviously he was correct. General Benjamin F. Butler saw it as if we arm these Negroes and offer them their freedom, they're not going to turn their guns against us. They're going to fight the Confederates as viciously and as violently as they can. They're going to take that anger, those centuries worth of anger out on them. And this is how we're going to win the war. But a lot of people, again, they disagree with Butler. And according to the historical record, Butler was not a good war commander anyway. He lost a lot of battles. He lost a lot of ground. And he just wasn't a powerful military man. Okay? So what he said, how he felt, it didn't hold a lot of weight anyway. Because, he wasn't a good war general. He wasn't a good war major. That's just what they say about him. But he believed that the Negro would fight. And so what they're talking about is 3 escaped enslaved men made it to his camp seeking freedom. And he manipulated the wording in his debate arguments. He said, okay, I'm going to call these men contraband. Now, we understand contraband is kind of like property. It's property that you're not supposed to have, but you have it, right? And so he was saying, since the Southerners consider these Negroes as property, we're going to call them contraband of war, as in we're seizing this property. In war, they have what they call booty, or the spoils of war, right? An individual may, I'm gonna just be specific. In the Civil War, as the Union Army went to various plantations in the South, kicking butt and taking names, what do you think the soldiers did when they seized a major plantation? Anybody who has watched a war movie or who has studied war, you know that one of the benefits of being a soldier is when you seize land, seize territory, seize property, you take what you want. So the Union soldiers, whenever they went to these properties, they would, if they found money, they took it. If they found valuables, they took it. If they found horses, they took it. If they found food, they took it. If they found good china, good silverware, they took it. Those are the spoils of war. If there's $100,000 worth of precious jewels inside of this plantation, when we seize this plantation, the Union soldiers who seized the plantation are going to take the $100,000 worth of jewels and diamonds. They're going to take it. It got so bad that members, people that were on the plantations, knowing that the Union Army was coming and making spoils of all of their goods, they had their slaves dig holes out on the plantation or out in the woods, and they buried all of their goods. They buried their good china. They buried their silver. They buried their gold coins. They buried their jewelry, their rings, their necklaces, their bracelets. They buried the things of value so the Union Army wouldn't take it. And then they had in their mind that after the war, they would come back, dig it up, and they would still have their riches. Now, in some cases, they died. Their enslaved people died or got the freedom, and there are still treasures buried around the South right now today. Several years ago, I think it was a little over a decade ago, they found tons of gold that had been buried since the Civil War. So Butler said, since the Confederacy considers these men as property, I'm just going to call them contraband. In the same way, we can take their horses, we can take their cattle, we can take their food, we can take their possessions out of their homes and use it for the Union Army. We can take their slaves, and we have as much right to use them as the enemy does. And so he used that classification of the Negro being property against the Confederacy. Look, he says, over the next several months, 900 more escaped enslaved men and their families arrived at Fort Monroe. The Lincoln administration, worried about losing the support of the pro-union slaveholding states. Some states in the Union had slaves, such as Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, denounced the act. They denounced what General Butler, Major Butler, and others were doing. And they say, look what the site says. Despite the official policy of refusing African Americans the opportunity to fight for their freedom, 2 more generals soon joined Butler. Major General John C. Fremont in Missouri and Major General David Hunter in South Carolina proclaimed all enslaved persons in Union-held territory in Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina free and able to enlist. Again, the Lincoln administration refuted the general's authority and banned the practice. So while the generals on the ground began to say that, hey, man, damn what y'all talking about. If you want us to win this war, we need the help of the Negro race. Period. We can't win without them. Now, Lincoln and President Abraham Lincoln and his administration, even though he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, at first he was against it. Right? He was against it because there were pro-union slave holding states. Every state that had slaves wasn't with the Confederacy. When you talk about the American Civil War, it's a very nuanced topic and there are a lot of moving parts. You understand what I'm saying? That's why when Abraham Lincoln did write the Emancipation Proclamation, he used very specific language. Matter of fact, I'm going to show you. This is what he said. Remember what I just read to you. And then look at the Emancipation Proclamation and look how it's worded. And you're going to understand based on what I just told you, when Lincoln finally decided that they needed the Negro to fight, when he finally accepted it, it was in 1863. Well, he accepted it in 1862. But the Emancipation Proclamation didn't take effect until January the 1st, 1863. So the Civil War kicked off in 1861. So it took several years for Lincoln to realize we need the help of the Negroes. But look how he words it. Look, this is the Emancipation Proclamation. You probably can't see it too well, but I'm going to read it. The top says, by the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd day of September in the year of our Lord 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following to wit. So he writes the Emancipation Proclamation September 22nd, 1862. This is when he writes it. This is when he finally accepts they need the Negroes' help. What does he say? He says that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated territory or designated part of a state, the people wherein shall the people therein shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then therefore and forever free. So he says that, okay, look, on January the 1st, 1863, anybody that's held as a slave within any state or designated part of a state where the people of that state are in rebellion against the United States, those people held as slaves in those states in rebellion shall hereby and therefore and forever be free. Meaning the Emancipation Proclamation granted freedom to who? The men and women who were held enslaved in the states that were in rebellion. The states that were in rebellion. So any Confederate state, any state that was a part of the Confederacy that had slaves, any slave in a Confederate state was by order of the president designated as forever free on January the 1st, 1863. He worded it like that because he didn't want to offend the pro-union slave holding states. That's why it's designated or directed directly at the states that are in rebellion. That's who he was talking to. So when we go back to what we just read on the website, it'll make more sense. You see, it'll make more sense. Look, they say that the Lincoln administration worried about losing the support of the pro-union slave-holding states. The pro-union slave-holding states weren't in open rebellion. They weren't with the Confederacy because they're pro-union. Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland denounced the act, despite the following policy of refusing African Americans the opportunity, blah, 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 blah. Then they say, again, the Lincoln administration refuted the general's authority and banned the practice. That's why you always hear a quote, the Abraham Lincoln quote, where Abraham Lincoln says his only goal was to save the Union. He didn't want the country split into the northern United States, southern the Confederacy. He didn't want the United States split in half. And he didn't want the Confederacy to totally take over, because remember, the Confederacy had they had put their own president in power, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the president of the Confederacy. So when the Civil War was going on, you had two seats of power in America. You had Abraham Lincoln and you had Andrew Jackson. Now, according to Abraham Lincoln and the Union, Andrew Jackson, he really was a usurper, right? It was almost like it was a coup, a government coup. As in right now, Donald Trump is the president, right? Now, let's say I gather a lot of people behind me and we want to overthrow the president. And then we all say, you know what? Matthew Daniels is our president. We don't recognize President Trump. And then we go to war. If we defeat you guys, President Trump, you're no longer the president. And guess what? President Matthew Daniels is the new president. So there were two presidents at the time. And in essence, until the end of the Civil War, you had a potentiality for two nations to come from the splitting of the United States. And Abraham Lincoln said in that famous quote that his only intent was to preserve the Union. He said, if I could preserve the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do that. If I could preserve the Union by freeing every slave, I would do that. Meaning, what if keeping slavery would have preserved the Union, he was going to do it. If ending slavery was going to preserve the Union, he was going to do it, because his point was he wanted to preserve the Union. However, he had to do that. He was willing to concede anything. And they realized that they would lose the war. They had a very good chance of losing the Civil War if they didn't allow the Negro to fight for them, because that did two things. One, it gave them more fighting men who could fight and die for the cause of the Union, right? Also, it took away the safety net of the Confederacy. While the white Confederates were all fighting the Union, the slave population they were helping them by digging trenches, carrying food, carrying weapons for the Confederacy, and they were also still taking care of the plantations while the white population was fighting the Union. And so they kind of had a fail-safe. They had all of this free labor to assist them in the war. And so the Union realized, you know what? We need to take that fail-safe from them. We need to take that safety net. if we can take the people that are taking care of their plantation, if we can take from them their source of economics, if we can take from them the people that's carrying their food, carrying their arms, digging their trenches, right? Putting up their forts, taking down their forts, cutting trees down for them. If we can take the people that's working for free on the behalf of the Confederacy, which is freeing them up to fight us, if we can take them people, we hurt the Confederacy. Then we take those people, give them guns, and make them fight the Confederacy. We hit them with a double whammy. We take their failsafe, and then we use their failsafe against them. The Union can win. And that is how the Civil War eventually came to an end. Look, in 1862, as the war became increasingly bloody, official policy shifted towards enabling African Americans the right to fight for themselves. Substantial numbers of African Americans, led by African American intellectuals and abolitionists, one of them was Frederick Douglass, repeatedly lobbied the government until their pleas could no longer be ignored. So African Americans, blacks, Negroes, the whole time they were begging. When they saw the Civil War kick off, they saw their opportunity to get free, and they begged to put boots on the ground. Nobody was ever afraid. We was the epitome of give me liberty or give me death. That's all they ever wanted, was the opportunity. You put that musket in my hand, you put that bayonet in my hand, I'm gonna do what I have to do to help my people get free. They begged the government to let them fight. So the notion of whether or not they'll fight, you know they're gonna fight. They asked you to fight, they begged you to fight, they put it on everything that they love that they're gonna fight. With Union forces depleted almost 40% due to deaths, wounds, illness, and desertion, and with many initial enlistments ending, the Lincoln administration relented in the summer of 1862. So the Union is fighting the Confederacy. They refusing to use the Negro help. By the summer of 1862, they had depleted almost 40% of their army. That's almost half. You can't keep that up. They couldn't keep that up. The Lincoln administration, they realized, oh, wait a minute, if we're going to win this war, we need help. We need help. We need help. So I would never ignore what the white or European Americans did in the Civil War. I'm not here to take anything from anybody, but I'm here to highlight what the Negro race did. That's what I'm here to highlight. And I'm here to highlight that, let the truth be told, the Union never would have won if they didn't put guns in our hands. Period. With Union forces depleted, look, this is the National Museum of the United States Army. This their website. .org. This is an official website. This is their article. I'm not making this up. This is what they say. This is what they say. With Union forces depleted almost 40% due to deaths, wounds, illness, and desertion. What's desertion? That's running. You running. You on the front line. You on the battlefield. It get too hot. You don't want to die. You want to go home to your wife. You want to go home to your mama. You want to go home to your kids, so you desert the army. They were running away. But they got the nerve to ask the question, will the Negro fight? Brother, will you fight? And with many initial enlistments ending, because you only enlist for a certain amount of years, and then you have to renew that enlistment, they were trying to get out of there. The Lincoln administration relented. They were forced. Lincoln was forced in the summer of 1862. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation was written when? Family? 1862. On this day, it was September 22nd, 1862. And it took effect January the 1st, 1863. Because in the summer almost half of the Union Army was wiped out. So in the fall, the season that comes immediately after the summer, September is the fall, Abraham Lincoln is signing that Emancipation Proclamation. Look, Congress, with President Abraham Lincoln's support, passed the Second Confiscation Act and Militia Act on July 17, 1862. These acts freed any enslaved person who left a disloyal owner in the rebellious states and allowed the president to employ as many persons of African descent as he may deem necessary. So remember, he fought it at first, but then in the summer, he realized, damn, we almost halfway out of there. We can't keep this up. So he joined the call of men like General Butler. Remember the name Butler? He joined the ranks of men like Major General Butler and was like, you know what? Any enslaved person that escapes from the South and makes it to our side, we can use you in the war effort. Now, at first, they tried to utilize us, carrying food, cooking food, digging trenches, building forts, destroying railroads, doing any task other than carrying a pistol. But they had to put that pistol in our hand eventually. Look, however, the acts fell short. What acts? The first and the second Confiscation Act and Militia Act on July 17th, 1862. This is the act that they're talking about. And they're calling it confiscation because the Negro was property. They were confiscating property. They were just wording it. They had to word it a certain way. So look, however, the acts fell short in two significant ways. First, it limited enlisted African Americans to menial tasks, auxiliary roles, and support positions away from combat. Second, it limited the pay of enlisted African Americans to 30% less than their white counterparts in the Army, a discrepancy that went unfixed for over 2 years. Despite the limitations of the government's policy, change soon came to the Union Army. Change happened slowly and over time. So when Lincoln and his administration finally broke, they were like, okay. We'll take those escaped slaves and we'll let them enlist in the army. But they still didn't want to give them guns. They still didn't want to give them guns in July. We'll use them for menial tasks. They can dig our trenches. They can put up our forts. They can cook our food. They can wash our clothes. They can carry our ammunition. But if we give them a gun, they were still afraid to put a gun in our hand. And they only put a gun in our hand when they realized they had no choice. It was either put a gun in our hand or history, we will be the Confederate States of America today. If they didn't put a gun in our hand, we'll be the Confederate States of America today. I'm going to skip that. I'm going into that in just a second. But look, the first regiments of the colored troops, almost immediately after the two acts, Butler, that's that name again, remember the name, Butler, then stationed in New Orleans, raised several regiments of Louisiana natives and renamed them the Corps d'Afrique, of Africans, one of the first official U.S. Army regiments of color. Other officers soon followed suit with state militias from Massachusetts and Union-occupied portions of South Carolina, forming multiple regiments each within weeks. The initial Emancipation Proclamation, issued in September 1862, took effect on January 1st, 1863, and officially freed all enslaved persons in Confederate-held territory while increasing the allotment of African-American enlistment to 200,000 soldiers. While increasing the allotment of African-American enlistment to 200,000 soldiers. So when they realized that they were going to lose the war without the Negro, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued in September of 1862. It took effect in January of 1863. And then after that, in May of 1863, this document here was released. A document known as General Orders number 143 from the War Department, which officially made the regiment of United States troops that we call today the United States Colored Troops. With getting paid less than the whites, yes, but getting paid off of retirement, able to carry arms, full regiments of Negroes, Negroes with rank, going into battle, leading battles, and putting in work, saving the Union, really. That's what you got to understand. Your ancestors saved the Union. Your ancestors saved the Union. So let's get back into this slideshow real quick. You know, we talking some good history. This is some good history. You need to see this. So after the Emancipation Proclamation is signed, because everything must be done in decency and order, in May 22nd, 1863, you get General Order number 143. Look what it says. In the first section, a bureau is established in the Adjutant General's office for the record of all matters relating to the organization of colored troops. An officer will be assigned to the charge of the bureau with such number of clerks as may be designated by the Adjutant General. Look, let's go down to section 4. No persons shall be allowed to recruit for colored troops except specially authorized by the War Department, and no such authority will be given to persons who have not been examined and passed by a board, nor will such authority be given any one person to raise more than one regiment. So they're making stipulations and guidelines to how these Negro troops will be armed, and they have to be armed by specially authorized agents. This is just to control the influx of the colored troops, because again, they were scared. Sandra Askew says, great research, my brother. Thank you for sharing. You're more than welcome. Appreciate it. You know, I'm the real bookworm. This is what I do. I read, I study, and I like to bring this history. So look, let's go down to section 6. Colored troops may be accepted by companies to be afterwards consolidated in battalions and regiments by the Adjutant General. The regiments will be numbered seriatim in the order in which they are raised. The numbers to be determined by the Adjutant General. They will be designated. How will they be designated? As Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops. And that dash is basically like whatever number they are. Then the Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops. And so the U.S. Colored Troops were born out of a necessity. The United States Colored Troops were raised to save the Union. It is what it is. And so, with that history in mind, what I'm going to show you guys now is someone who actually was one of those first United States Colored Troops. And we're just going to read through some of the things he talked about and see it from this firsthand historical perspective. Because it's one thing to read about it on a website. It's one thing to read what the United States Army has to say. It's one thing to read what the European Americans had to say, what General Butler had to say, Robert E. Lee had to say, etc., had to say. It's one thing to hear from a modern day historian, even from someone like myself in the modern day talking about this. But what I like to do is let the ancestors speak. How about we hear from someone on the ground, a Negro who was a slave, who did escape and join what became known as the United States Colored Troops. Let's get to the primaries, family. See, I keep telling you guys, our ancestors left so many records. They left so many records. They talk about so much history, and we can get that history from their perspective. Now, the gentleman that we're going to talk about today is William I. Johnson Jr. Now, he was born February the 14th, 1840. That's Valentine's Day. He was born on Valentine's Day. Okay. And he says that he was born in a place called Albemarle County. But the man that he was that he called Old Man George, he eventually passed away. And when they divided up his estate, they divided up his property. William Johnson Jr. was then given to Old Man George's daughter. She married a man with the last name Johnson, who lived in a place called Goochland County, Virginia. And so William Johnson Jr., he was living in Goochland County, Virginia, property of a man named Johnson and a lady who was the daughter of his original owner. Okay. Now, he says in his autobiography that he was hired out to several different people over the years. But at the time of the Civil War, he was actually in Goochland County on the plantation, and he did the job of a butler. He was working as a butler. He stopped being hired out on Christmas Eve, 1859. So on Christmas Eve, 1859, about a year and a half before the Civil War kicked off, he was no longer hired out to other people. He stayed on the Johnson plantation, and he worked as a butler. He was trained up to be a butler in the house, basically like take care of the house, cook, clean, tend to the family that owns the plantation, etc. And so he gives us plenty of information about his life on the plantation. Now, I may do a full story on his life later, but I'm not going to go through everything. But what I want to do is get to the part about him being in the Civil War. Okay. Now he tells us that, again, he's on this plantation in Virginia when the Civil War kicks off. So obviously he's enslaved by Confederates. So the Confederates that he's enslaved by, or that he's in close proximity to, they capture some Union soldiers. They take them as prisoners of war, and they hold them as prisoners for a while. Now, while these Union soldiers, what he calls Yankees, while these Yankees were prisoners with the Confederacy, William Johnson, and a couple of other Negroes were able to talk to these Yankee prisoners. And when they talked to these Yankee prisoners, the Yankee prisoners told them what was going on. Because remember, a lot of our ancestors, they weren't really educated. They couldn't read. They weren't able to read the newspaper. A lot of our ancestors did not know that the Civil War was going on. And when it did kick off, they didn't know the extent of it. They didn't know why it was happening. They didn't know about the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a lot of information that was kept from them. So look what he says. He says, in July 1864, my master's regiment captured a gang of Yankee soldiers and brought them into camp to keep them until they could be transferred to Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. So if you paying attention to the timeline, chronology, remember, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in January of 1863, and they started raising these colored regiments, right? The official order came down in May of 63, right? So this is a little over a year after the United States Colored Troops have actually been created. A little over a year after that, he's still enslaved. He's in Virginia, and the Confederates capture some Yankees. He says, we were encamped up near Fredericksburg. At that time, the rebels were trying to take Washington. The rebels are the Confederacy, the Yankees are the Union. He says, I didn't know what the war was all about, nor why they were fighting. So no one told him, hey, President Abraham Lincoln said you're free. Of course not. He says, but when the rebels were out on the battlefield, a few pickets, soldiers, were left to guard the prisoners, and the servants got a chance to talk to the Yankee prisoners. They explained to us about slavery and freedom. They told us if we got a chance to steal away from camp and got over to the Yankee side, we would be free. They said if we win, the Yankees, all your colored folks will be free. But if the rebels win, you will always be slaves. So they're talking in reference to the change in policy. Remember the contraband laws, the Emancipation Proclamation, the general order that made the United States colored troops. So he's telling us on the ground, when these events are taking place, this is how it looked on the ground. The Yankees tell him, hey, they explain slavery and freedom. They holding y'all enslaved. President Abraham Lincoln that said that all of y'all are free. You guys are really free, but to enjoy your freedom, we have to win this war. Or if you could just escape from this plantation, if you can make it to where the Union soldiers are, you free. All you have to do is just get to the Yankee side, you see? But them Yankees also knew you need to get to the Yankee side, you need to get to the Union side and help us fight. Help us fight these Confederates. And you and all of your family will be free, and y'all will forever be free. But if y'all don't help, you'll be a slave forever. So what did he do? Did he tuck tail? Did he cower? Did he say, oh, I'm not man enough to fight? Hell no. Your ancestors weren't cowards just because they were enslaved. That's why I talk about this stuff. You have to see who your ancestors really were. Look, those words got into our heads. We got together, 5 of us, and decided to take the chance one night, and we made it. So he's one of these contrabands that we just read about in the article now. Him and 5 others, or 4 others. Of course, let's just skip that. So basically, he tells how they escaped. I don't want to read everything. Look, he says he remembers 3 of them, the men that were with him. I'm going to read this part because may your name live on forever and may your memory never die. I remember 3 of the men. Joe Roberts, salute to you. Sam Smith, salute to you. Myself and the 2 others whose names I didn't know. We reached Washington the next day, and Yankee picket soldiers took us to the military headquarters. Roberts, Smith, the other 2 men were enlisted into the fighting regiments. Bam. So you now you get the history that he's talking about. When they escaped, no longer are they contraband now. Remember, they were contraband until the Emancipation Proclamation. With the Emancipation Proclamation, now they're free. So they're not just property anymore. So they get to the Union Army. Bam, they became free, and they were enlisted into the fighting regiments. What fighting regiments? The United States Colored Troops. You see, this is what it looked like on the ground. And there were so many, thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands who escaped, joined the army, and helped the Union Army defeat the Confederates. Now we're seeing some of their names: Joe Roberts, Sam Smith, and these 2 other unnamed ancestors salute. Fighting for our freedom. They're the reason. Listen, these men and women are the reason we're on the internet having this conversation with each other right now today. Because had they not did that, the Union would have lost, and we'll still be on a plantation somewhere and slavery will still be going on. So you got to salute him. He says, but I was lucky enough to be sent with another group of men to Boston, Massachusetts, where I was assigned to General Butler's division into the quartermaster's corps in charge of food and rations. Now, why was he put in charge of food and rations? Because he was already trained up as a butler. So when they would escape, they would, okay, so who do you know how to read and write? Do you have any education? What did you do on the plantation? Oh, I did X, I did Y, I did Z. And then they would put you, into some type of position where you could help the Union Army. Since he was already trained up as a butler, they put him in charge of food and rations. The other men, most likely field hands, they was like, okay, we're going to give you a little bit of training, put a gun in your hand. You're going to have the opportunity to fight. But listen, look what he says. He says he went with a group of men to Boston, Massachusetts, where I was assigned to General Butler's division. What was the name I kept telling you guys to remember? Did y'all actually remember the name? It was General Butler. Remember, they say General Butler was one of the first people who said we need to arm the Negro. He was one of the first ones saying it. And so now William I. Johnson Jr., he's letting us know when he escaped, he got assigned to General Butler's division. This is accurate history, family. This is the historical record. He says our regiment saw active service around Petersburg, Danville, and Manassas. Manassas, when they talk about the battles of Bull Run, it was more than one battle of Bull Run, but the Battle of Bull Run is also known as Manassas. Now, he was there obviously in 63, not prior to that. So just keep the chronology in mind. He says we were active between Petersburg and Danville to cut off the rebels from the Norfolk and Western Railroad. Whenever you're in war, you have to try to control. I don't want to necessarily say traffic, but you want to control the roads. You want to control the railroads, because this is how supplies get moved back and forth. If you're a army regiment, you can't carry everything you need. Weapons, supplies, food. You can't carry everything on your back. And when you begin to run out of resources, your army needs to be able to get more resources to you so you can continue fighting. And you have to do that by means of transportation. So when he says that they were trying to cut off the rebels from the Norfolk and Western Railroad, what they were trying to do, matter of fact, what they were trying to do was hinder their ability to fight. I'm finna look something up. Watch this. Let's look up Battle of Petersburg Civil War. Let's see. Let's just go to Wikipedia first. Let's see what it says. Okay, look. Let me zoom in. I'm gonna make it just a little bit bigger. Hopefully you can see it better. All right. The Richmond-Petersburg campaign was a series of battles around Petersburg, Virginia, fought from June 9th, 1864 to March 25th, 1865 during the American Civil War. So this is the time period when ancestor William Johnson Jr. would have been there. Although it is more popularly known as the Siege of Petersburg, it was not a classic military siege in which a city is encircled with fortifications blocking all routes of ingress and egress, nor was it strictly limited to actions against Petersburg. The campaign consisted of 9 months of trench warfare in which Union forces, commanded by Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, assaulted Petersburg unsuccessfully and then constructed trench lines that eventually extended over 30 miles from the eastern outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, to around the eastern and southern outskirts of Petersburg. Look, this is what I was trying to explain right here. Petersburg was crucial to the supply of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army in the Confederate capital of Richmond. Richmond, Virginia was the capital. That was basically like headquarters number one. The Civil War was pretty much over when they conceded defeat in Richmond. But look what he says. Petersburg was crucial to the supply of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army in the Confederate capital of Richmond. The supply lines. That's why the ancestors was talking about the railroads. Look, numerous raids were conducted and battles fought in attempts to cut off the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad. So this is the official record, historical record of the war. This is exactly what the ancestor says. And I show you guys stuff like this so you can trust the historical reliability of these narratives that I'm showing you. These people, they were on the ground, right? Look, where he says it at. Let's go back. He says, our regiment saw active service around Petersburg, Danville, and Manassas. We were active between Petersburg and Danville to do what? Cut off the rebels from the Norfolk and Western Railroad. Because just like I just told you, it was the railroad was a supply line. So William Johnson Jr., he knows what he's talking about. War hero. He says, I never took part in any active fighting because I was always busy behind the lines, keeping the rations in readiness. We were always posted as to battles and battle plans so that we would know how and where to set up the camp kitchen for the regiment. So he's saying that even though he didn't see active duty, he wasn't actually fighting because he was taking care of the rations. He was trained as a butler. He was always up to date on the battles and the battle plans, not the confidential stuff. Don't get me wrong. But he was always up to date on the battles and the battle plans so that he would know how and where to set up the camp kitchen. Because if you're a soldier and you're at battle, you have to eat. Do you understand what I'm saying? If you're at war and the war lasts for several years, you have to eat. Or even several months or weeks, you need food, you need water, you need supplies. When people get hurt, they need somewhere to be taken or where they could be bandaged up. You get what I'm saying? Think what I'm talking about. So he knows about these battles, these battle plans. He knows what's going on in Petersburg. He knows about the railroad. He knows about the supply lines because he's right there. And the information that he's giving us is accurate. Look. This section is called Recall Battle Tactics. He's finna tell you about some of your heroes, your ancestral heroes, right? This is historically relevant. He says down there where Fort Harrison now stands, Negro soldiers fought a great battle and killed up 500 or 600 rebels in quote unquote, no time. So he's telling us about when these colored troops had a battle. This regiment of colored troops had a battle with the Confederates and killed about 500 or 600 of them. He says at that very spot is a monument built by the governor in honor of Corporal Dick Miles, flag bearer, for his outstanding bravery in that district before he was killed. He is reported to have carried the flag ahead of his company on 4 or 5 charges before he was finally shot. Now, when they're talking about this flag bearer, when the army was going off to war, someone would be in front of the army holding the flag, right? That's the flag bearer. And if that guy was shot and killed and he dropped and the flag dropped, it was somebody else's duty to pick that flag up. You could not let the flag fall. And so he's talking about a monument that was built in honor of this individual that was the flag bearer, because that's a very dangerous job, damn near like a suicide mission. They're going to want to kill that flag bearer to make the flag drop. And so this one flag bearer, he did it on 4 or 5 different charges. He was at the head of the troops carrying the flag, bullets flying by his head, but he didn't drop the flag before he was finally shot and killed. They say in the district, Yankee trenches were opposite the rebel trenches with about a quarter of a mile between them. On one Saturday night in May 1863, the Negro soldiers dug breastworks out toward the rebels' line about half the distance. So basically, what he's going to talk about is this one war where they killed like 500 or 600. You have the Yankees on one side, you have the rebels on another, or the Union on one side, the Confederates on the other. And so the Negro troops, they dig out breastworks, or basically like trenches. They dig a massive hole in the ground, but not just a hole. It's basically like a ditch because it's kind of deep and long. They dig this out in the ground, and then they cover it up with trees and bushes and leaves and grass. So you can't tell that it's a ditch or a hole in the ground. All you see is quote unquote grass, leaves, bushes. And so the next morning, after the colored troops dig this, the Yankees fire a few shots at the rebels to lure them in, to bait them in. They pow, 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 shoot at them. So the Confederates, they fire back, pow, 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 pow. He says this is at about 5 or 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, right? And then the rebels, they made a charge at the Yankees that had just shot at them. So the Negro soldiers, the United States colored troops that were there, he says that they didn't return fire when the rebels rushed towards them. They just sat, let them run towards them. They're just baiting them in. They're like, okay, come closer, come closer, come closer. And then as they came, they stepped on the trap. They fell in the trench. They fell in the ditch. They fell in the hole. And they all just start piling up on top of each other. They fell in. And so then the United States colored troops made a counter charge. Then they ran towards them. And while everybody was confused because they had fell in and it was one on top of the other, they started, the United States colored troops started shooting. Bow, 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 shooting. They stabbed them with bayonets. You got the bayonet has a long sword on the end of the gun. They were stabbing them. They was hitting them in the heads with the butts of their guns. They was puncturing them with the bayonets, and they were killing them. And so he says they killed not less than 500 to 600 on that morning and took a lot of prisoners. And so that was like an excellent military strategy that took place. So then he goes on to talk about what's known as the Battle of Seven Pines. He says down here below Richmond, at a place now called Seven Pines, Negro troops fought one of the fiercest battles of the war against the rebels. The battle lasted 7 days. Many men were killed on both sides, and when the battle was over, only 7 pine trees were left standing on the edge of the road, where previously there had been a great pine forest. After this battle, the place became known as Seven Pines. Now, he gives us history about the Battle of Seven Pines that I didn't see anywhere else. And so I'm going to go with his information. I'm going to go with his information. Uh, let me see. Battle of Seven Pines. Okay. Now, based on the years of this, I don't think he was there for this battle. I think this is something he heard about, something he learned about, right? But he's just giving us information about the Civil War and the Negro troops. Look what he says. The Battle of Seven Pines, also known as the Battle of Fair Oaks or Fair Oaks Station, took place on May 31st and June 1st, 1862 in Henrico County, Virginia, as part of the Peninsula Campaign of the American Civil War. You see? The Confederate assaults, although poorly coordinated, succeeded in driving back the Sixth Corps and inflicting heavy casualties. Hold on, let me zoom out a little bit. Okay. Yeah, look. So the casualties on the Union side, around 790 were killed, 3,594 wounded, and wait, am I reading that right? Yeah, and 1,047 were captured. On the Confederate side, it was just slightly more, but it was 980 killed, 4,749 wounded, and 405 captured or missing. So both sides suffered greatly in that. But when you look it up, let me find it. This is what I want to look at. Okay. In the official records, when they talk about it, they say that it lasted for 2 days. This is the contrasting. Look, fought over 2 days during the Peninsula Campaign. The Battle of Seven Pines resulted in heavy losses for both sides. So when I pull it up, it says it lasted for 2 days, but the ancestor says that it lasted for 7 days. Oh, yeah, that's what I wanted to show. Now, this is what's interesting. Look at this. When I look it up, look, the Britannica, Encyclopedia Britannica website, Britannica.com, when I Google it, before I click the link, right here, it says Battle of Seven Pines, 7 days campaign. Right? 7, you see it? 7 days campaign. When it's talking about the Battle of Seven Pines. But then when I click on it, I open it up, I go into it. Look what it says. Right here. So I don't know why before I click on it, it says 7-day campaign. But after I click on it, it calls it a 2-day battle. I'm not sure what they're actually counting. You know, hold on, let me see. Oh wait, maybe the final phase. Oh, maybe this is it. Oh, maybe this is what he's talking about. Perhaps there was more than one battle that took place there, family. Because now I didn't see this earlier when I read it. But here he says, right here, A second phase was characterized by 3 weeks of inactivity. The final phase ended triumphantly for the Confederate forces of General Lee, who forced the withdrawal of the Federal Army of the Potomac after the 7 Days Battle. Let me click on this 7 Days Battle. Let me see. 7 Days Battle. Series of American Civil War battles in which a Confederate army joined George B. McClellan's Union forces and thwarted the Northern attempt to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. McClellan was forced to retreat from a position 4 miles east of the Confederate capital to a new base of operations at Harrison's Landing on James River. At the indecisive Battle of Oak Grove, Lee's attack on the Union right at Mechanicsville was repulsed with great losses, but Lee and General Stonewall Jackson combined to defeat General Fitzjohn Porter's Fifth Corps in a bloody encounter at Gaines Mill. Okay, so it looks like multiple battles took place there. Okay, I get it now. Multiple battles took place there. And the one that the ancestor William Johnson Jr. is talking about is the one that lasted for 7 days. That's the one he's talking about. That make a little more sense. And then the last battle that he tells us about is called the Battle of Manassas. Sometimes you're going to see this when you pull it up as the Battle of Bull Run. He says Butler's last major battle was at Manassas. Now, Butler again is the guy that we read about in the beginning. The Negroes again made a great stand, and it was here that the pride of Virginia, the UMI cadets, were practically wiped out. And so after that, he basically, he finishes his autobiography and he tells you about what he did after the war. He mentions going back for Christmas, back to Goochland County to see his mother and other family members. And he actually sees his old master. And they both talk about the war, being on opposite sides of the war. And his master basically says that this must be how God wanted it to end, with the Union Army winning. So it was no hard feelings. Now, I'm going to go in and do a video on this guy at a later date to talk about more of his life, because he ended up being a member of the church. He was a member of the Odd Fellows. He eventually became a Mason. He joined a group called the Good Samaritans. And he did a lot of good work, not only being at Butler for the United States colored troops in the United States Civil War. So we're going to go into his life a little bit more at a later date, but we just wanted to go there first. We just wanted to talk about that first. And we wanted to highlight the United States colored troops. So when we talk about authentic, accurate history, we just have to understand first and foremost that the African American, the Black, the Negro has fought in every single American war. In between wars and during wars, sometimes their roles were limited based on the bigotry that was in the nation at that time. But they fought in every single war, including the American Revolution. So although our ancestors didn't get their independence on July 4th, 1776, And some people say that they don't want to celebrate the 4th of July because our ancestors were still enslaved. That's true. But also what's true, because history is very, very nuanced and there's a lot of moving parts. A lot of your ancestors were already free before that, free during that, and free after that. And they fought in the Revolutionary War. And they fought in the War of 1812. And they fought in the Civil War. And without fighting in the Civil War, the Union Army would have lost. That's just the truth, you know. So in this video, I just wanted to highlight not only the United States colored troops, but I wanted to highlight a soldier of the United States colored troops, Ancestor William I. Johnson Jr. We salute you. And as I salute him, I also want to salute my direct ancestor, Thomas Daniels Sr., for being one of the first Buffalo soldiers, you know, and fighting in the Indian Wars. So we're going to end it right there on that note. And for the ancestor, William I. Johnson Jr., may your name live on forever, and may your memory never die. Hotel, I'm out.